It was a cold October night, and I was driving down Route 66, the kind of road that stretches forever under a black, starless sky. The kind of road where the only light comes from your own headlights, and the only sound is the hum of your engine. I was alone, just me and my thoughts, trying to make it to the next town before midnight. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the emptiness of the highway was starting to get to me. You know that feeling, right? When the silence becomes too loud and every shadow seems to move just a little too fast? I was about an hour outside of Amarillo when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. The road was long and straight, and fatigue was starting to set in. But then she came into focus. A woman, standing on the side of the road, her arm raised as if she were hitchhiking. She was wearing a white dress, the kind that looked like it belonged in another era, and her hair was long and dark, blowing in the wind. Something about her made my skin crawl, but I couldn't just leave her there. It was the middle of nowhere, and the temperature was dropping fast. I pulled over, rolling down my window just enough to talk to her. "You need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound friendly despite the unease creeping up my spine. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with these hollow, empty eyes. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, she said, "Thank you." She opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. And that's when I noticed how cold the air around her was. It was like sitting next to an open freezer. I tried to make small talk as I pulled back onto the road. "Where are you headed?" I asked, glancing at her out of the corner of my eye. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stared straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Finally, she said, "Just keep driving. You'll know when we get there." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't know what else to do. I kept driving, the silence between us growing heavier with every mile. After a while, I started to notice something strange. The road ahead seemed different. The lines on the asphalt were faded, almost invisible, and the trees on either side of the road looked twisted and gnarled, like something out of a nightmare. I glanced at the woman, but she was still staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. Do you come this way often?" I asked, trying to break the tension. She turned to me then, and I wish she hadn't. Her eyes were black, like two bottomless pits, and her smile was too wide, too sharp. "I've been here before," she said, her voice echoing in a way that shouldn't have been possible. "But you haven't. Not yet." My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to pull over to tell her to get out of my car, but something stopped me. Something told me that if I did, things would only get worse. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, the road stretching on endlessly before us. Then, out of nowhere, she pointed to a narrow dirt path that branched off from the main road. "Turn here," she said, her voice cold and commanding. I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep going, to ignore her and drive as fast as I could in the opposite direction. But my hands seemed to move on their own, turning the wheel and guiding the car onto the dirt path. The trees closed in around us, their branches scraping against the sides of the car like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging up the windshield. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer, just kept staring straight ahead, her expression blank. The path ended abruptly at a clearing, and that's when I saw it. A house, or what was left of one. It was old, the wood rotting and the windows shattered. The front door hung open, swaying slightly in the wind. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where it happened." I didn't want to ask. I didn't want to know. But the words slipped out anyway. "Where what happened?" She turned to me then, and I'll never forget the look in her eyes. It was like staring into the face of pure despair. "This is where I died," she said, her voice breaking. "This is where he killed me." My blood ran cold. "Who killed you?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the car door and stepped out, her movements slow and deliberate. I wanted to drive away, to leave her there and never look back. But I couldn't. I was frozen, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. She walked toward the house, her white dress glowing faintly in the darkness. When she reached the door, she turned back to me and said, "You should go before he finds you." "Who?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer. That just disappeared into the house, the door slamming shut behind her. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from inside the house. I didn't wait to see who or what was making them. I threw the car into reverse and slammed on the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt as I backed out of the clearing. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, like my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the car straight. I never saw the woman again. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A figure in a white dress, standing on the side of the road, and I know, deep down, that she's still out there, waiting, watching. And I can't help but wonder, who's next?
Story number 2.
It was a Friday night, and I was driving home after a long week of work. The kind of week that makes you want to collapse into bed and not move for days. I was on Interstate 80, somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, when I realized I was almost out of gas. The nearest town was still about 20 miles away, and my fuel light had been on for what felt like forever. I was starting to panic when I saw it. A dimly lit gas station just off the highway. It looked like it had been there since the 1950s, the kind of place where you half expect to see a group of greasers hanging out by the pumps. But at that point, I didn't care. I just needed gas. I pulled in, the gravel crunching under my tires, and rolled up to the pump. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. There was no one around, no cars, no attendants, nothing. Just a flickering neon sign that read, "Open 24 hours," and a single light bulb swinging in the breeze above the door. I got out of the car and started pumping gas, my eyes darting around nervously. That's when I noticed the figure standing in the shadows near the edge of the lot. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat that seemed to blend into the darkness. He was just standing there, staring at me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that he was probably just waiting for someone, but something about him made my skin crawl. I finished pumping the gas as quickly as I could and jumped back into my car, locking the doors behind me. As I pulled out of the station, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the man still standing there, watching me drive away. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I got back on the highway, the gas station disappearing in my rearview mirror. The road was empty, just like before, and I was starting to relax when I saw it. A pair of headlights in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another car, but as it got closer, I realized something was off. The lights were too bright, too intense, like they were burning right through me, and they were coming up fast. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, but the lights kept getting closer. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. That's when I noticed something else. The car behind me wasn't making any noise. No engine roar, no tires on the pavement, just silence. I glanced in my rearview mirror again, and that's when I saw it. The car was black, with no visible driver. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, but I could feel it. Something was in there, watching me. I tried to shake the thought, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the car kept coming, closer and closer, until it was right on my tail. I swerved into the left lane, hoping it would pass me, but it didn't. It stayed right behind me, its headlights blinding me every time I looked in the mirror. I was starting to panic, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. That's when I saw the exit up ahead. I didn't know where it led, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that car. I took the exit at the last possible second, my tires squealing as I rounded the corner. The black car didn't follow me. It just kept going, disappearing into the darkness of the highway. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. That's when I noticed something else. The road I was on, it wasn't on my GPS. In fact, it didn't seem to lead anywhere. Just a narrow, winding path through the woods. I was about to turn around when I saw it. A sign, barely visible in the dim light of my headlights. It read, "Welcome to Black Hollow." I didn't know what to do. I was lost, alone, and the thought of going back onto the highway with that car still out there was too much to bear. So I kept driving, hoping I'd find some kind of civilization. But the further I went, the darker it got. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. And then I saw it, a house, just off the side of the road. It was old, the paint peeling and the windows boarded up, but there was a light on inside. I pulled into the driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I couldn't keep driving. I got out of the car and walked up to the door, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I knocked, the sound loud and hollow, and waited. The door creaked open, and I saw him, the man from the gas station. He was standing there, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and empty. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with that same unnerving intensity. I need help, I stammered, my voice trembling. I'm lost. He didn't respond, just stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. I hesitated, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run. But I didn't. I stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind me. The house was cold, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The walls were covered in old photographs, their faces blurred and distorted. And then I saw it, a picture of the black car parked in front of the house. The man was standing next to it, his hand resting on the hood. But the car wasn't empty. There was someone inside, their face pressed against the window, their eyes wide with terror. I turned to the man, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer, just smiled, his teeth yellow and jagged. And then I heard it, the sound of an engine roaring to life outside. I ran to the window and saw it. The black car, its headlights blazing, parked in the driveway. The door was open, waiting for me. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped, alone, and the man was standing between me and the only way out. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then I saw it, a way out. A back door, just visible through the darkness. I didn't think. I just ran, my feet pounding against the floor as I bolted for the door. I could hear the man behind me, his footsteps slow and deliberate, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, out into the night, the cold air biting at my skin. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove away as fast as I could, the black car and the house disappearing in my rearview mirror. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away. I never went back to that road. But sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I see it. The black car, its headlights blazing, following me from a distance. And I know, deep down, that it's still out there, waiting, watching. And I can't help but wonder, who's next?
Story number 3.
It was a rainy night in late November, and I was driving through the back roads of rural Pennsylvania, the kind of roads that twist and turn through dense forests where the trees loom overhead like silent sentinels. I was on my way to visit a friend, but the storm had slowed me down, and I was running late. The rain was coming down in sheets, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up, and the road was slick with water. I was starting to regret taking this shortcut when I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires skidding on the wet pavement. The car came to a stop just a few feet away from the figure, and that's when I realized it was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, wearing a soaked yellow raincoat and holding a teddy bear. Her hair was plastered to her face, and she was shivering violently. I rolled down my window, the rain spilling inside. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the storm. She didn't answer, just stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door and stepped out into the rain. "Hey, it's okay," I said, crouching down to her level. "What are you doing out here? Where are your parents?" She pointed down the road, her hand trembling. "They're at the house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I got lost. I looked in the direction she was pointing, but all I could see was darkness and rain. "Come on," I said, taking her hand. "Let's get you out of the rain." I helped her into the car, the heat blasting to warm her up. She sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching her teddy bear tightly. "What's your name?" I asked as I got back behind the wheel. "Emily," she said softly. "Okay, Emily, where's your house? Can you show me?" She nodded and pointed again. "It's not far. Just keep driving." I followed her directions, the road winding deeper into the forest. The rain was still pouring down, and the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches scraping against the car like skeletal fingers. I kept glancing at Emily, trying to reassure her, but she just stared straight ahead, her expression blank. After about 10 minutes, I saw it. A house just off the side of the road. It was an old two-story farmhouse, its paint peeling and its windows dark. There was a single light on in an upstairs window, flickering faintly through the rain. "Is that it?" I asked, pulling into the driveway. Emily nodded. "Yes. Thank you for helping me." I parked the car and got out, opening her door to help her out. "Come on, let's get you inside," I said, taking her hand. We walked up to the front door, the rain soaking through my clothes. I knocked, the sound echoing in the silence. No one answered. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. "Maybe they're upstairs," Emily said, her voice trembling. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly. The inside of the house was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The furniture was covered in dust, and the walls were lined with old photographs, their faces blurred and faded. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty house. "Is anyone home?" There was no answer, just the sound of the rain pounding against the windows. I turned to Emily, but she was gone. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. "Emily?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" I heard a sound from upstairs, a soft, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps. I hesitated for a moment, then started up the stairs, my hand gripping the banister tightly. The steps groaned under my weight, and the air grew colder with every step I took. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw her, Emily, standing at the end of the hallway. She was facing away from me, her yellow raincoat dripping water onto the floor. "Emily?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer, just stood there, perfectly still. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Emily, let's go back downstairs, okay?" That's when she turned around. But it wasn't Emily anymore. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes black and empty. Her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice echoing in a way that shouldn't have been possible. "Now you'll never leave." I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the floor as I bolted down the stairs. I could hear her behind me, her laughter echoing through the house. I didn't stop until I reached the front door, slamming it shut behind me and running to my car. I didn't look back. I just drove, the rain and darkness swallowing the house behind me. I didn't stop until I reached my friend's house, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. I never went back to that road. But sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I see her, Emily, standing on the side of the road, her yellow raincoat glowing faintly in the darkness. And I know deep down that she's still out there, waiting, watching. And I can't help but wonder, who's next?
Story number 4.
It was a hot summer night, and I was driving through the desert on my way to Las Vegas. The kind of night where the air feels heavy and the stars seem to stretch on forever. I was alone, just me and the open road, the hum of my engine the only sound for miles. I had the windows down, the warm breeze blowing through the car, and I was feeling good. That is, until I saw the hitchhiker. He was standing on the side of the road, his thumb out, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn-out cowboy hat. He looked like he'd been walking for days. His clothes were dusty, his boots scuffed, and he carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Something about him made me uneasy, but I couldn't just leave him there. It was the middle of the desert, and the nearest town was at least 50 miles away. I pulled over, rolling down my window. "Need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound friendly despite the knot of unease in my stomach. He nodded, his face still hidden under the hat. "Much obliged," he said in a low, gravelly voice. He opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, his duffel bag resting at his feet. The moment he closed the door, the air in the car seemed to grow colder, despite the heat outside. I pulled back onto the road, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Just up the road," he said, his voice flat. "I'll let you know when we get there." I nodded, focusing on the road ahead. The silence between us was heavy, and I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them under the brim of his hat. After a while, I started to notice something strange. The road ahead seemed different. The lines on the asphalt were faded, almost invisible, and the desert on either side of the road looked darker, more foreboding. I glanced at the hitchhiker, but he was still staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. You come this way often? I asked, trying to break the tension. He turned to me then, and I wish he hadn't. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were black, like two bottomless pits. His lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. I've been here before, he said, his voice echoing in a way that shouldn't have been possible. But you haven't. Not yet. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to pull over, to tell him to get out of my car, but something stopped me. Something told me that if I did, things would only get worse. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, the road stretching on endlessly before us. Then, out of nowhere, he pointed to a narrow dirt path that branched off from the main road. Turn here, he said, his voice cold and commanding. I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep going, to ignore him and drive as fast as I could in the opposite direction. But my hands seemed to move on their own, turning the wheel and guiding the car onto the dirt path. The desert closed in around us, the cacti and scrub brush looking twisted and gnarled in the dim light of my headlights. The air grew colder and I could see my breath fogging up the windshield. Where are we going? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Just kept staring straight ahead, his expression blank. The path ended abruptly at a clearing, and that's when I saw it. A cabin, or what was left of one. It was old, the wood rotting and the windows shattered. The front door hung open, swaying slightly in the wind. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. This is it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This is where it happened. I didn't want to ask. I didn't want to know, but the words slipped out anyway. Where what happened? He turned to me then, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes. It was like staring into the face of pure despair. This is where I died, he said, his voice breaking. This is where they killed me. My blood ran cold. Who killed you? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the car door and stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. I wanted to drive away, to leave him there and never look back. But I couldn't. I was frozen. My hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. He walked toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the gravel. When he reached the door, he turned back to me and said, You should go, before they find you. Who? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer, just disappeared into the cabin, the door slamming shut behind him. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from inside the cabin. I didn't wait to see who or what was making them. I threw the car into reverse and slammed on the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt as I backed out of the clearing. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, in fact, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the car straight. I never saw the hitchhiker again. But sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A figure in a cowboy hat standing on the side of the road, and I know deep down that he's still out there, waiting, watching, and I can't help but wonder, who's next?
Story number 5.
It was a foggy night in late October, and I was driving through the back roads of upstate New York, the kind of roads that wind through dense forests where the trees seem to close in around you and the fog hangs heavy in the air. I was on my way home from a late shift at work, exhausted and eager to get back to my warm bed. The fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, and I was driving slower than usual, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A shadow, maybe, or a deer standing too close to the road. But as I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was standing on the side of the road, her long hair damp and clinging to her face, her white dress soaked and clinging to her skin. She was barefoot, her feet caked with mud, and she was shivering violently. I slowed down, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about her made me uneasy, but I couldn't just leave her there. It was the middle of nowhere, and the temperature was dropping fast. I rolled down my window, the cold air biting at my face. Are you okay? I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't answer, just stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door and stepped out into the fog. Hey, it's okay.